kind of hopefully a graphical demo to maybe get across better what I'm talking about. And of course, if anyone wants to look at any source code as well. So I might chop and change a little bit. So basically, I was in a whimsical mood when Nima and I were talking about bio and title and all that, and I thought, well, I came up with how I thought with XJC anyway. So this is a talk about getting XML documents into a Java program and maybe getting Java objects back out into XML, structured XML based on XML schema. Has anyone in the room ever used XJC as a tool? No one's ever? Any JAXB people at all?
I used something that used XJC internally.
Used it, then you've used it.
Very good.
Okay. Yes?
I've used JAXB.
You've used that?
And I was kind of involved with Dennis Sosnowski's Jython stuff.
Jython, yeah, okay. So, what am I going to talk about? Well, outline, I'm going to talk about something called Sticks, which is the project I'm working on, the domain that I'm in at the moment in my Java work. I'll introduce a little bit about how to get XML documents into a Java program, and that's a binding called JAXB. And then I come across the real problem, which is the Sticks schemas I was given wouldn't build using the XJC tool. So if they won't build, by build I mean you take XML schema files and you run it through a magical tool called XJC, comes with the JDK, and then you get Java objects, and now you're in the Java land, you're not parsing XML by hand. So I fought with issue 3 for weeks, flailing around, getting nowhere, and then thought, hold on, I need to write a tool that will make sure that XJC does what I want, given that I don't really know how it works and I don't understand its error messages very well. So I kind of sidestepped the problem to get it to go in the way I wanted it to go. And then I'll summarize. Any questions? Okay. So what is Sticks? This is 2 quotes from the Sticks website. It's basically the government giving money to agencies, MITRE in this case, MITRE Corporation, to make the job of the cyber defender better. Okay, it's really information sharing. If you're tasked with keeping your network and your hosts secure in some institution, and you see a bad thing happening, bad IP address, file that you don't understand, why is it in the Windows directory, you want to share that information. I've been attacked, we see these remnants, these observables, they're called, in my institution, and I need to share that with George because he's the network admin somewhere else. So really what Sticks is the vocabulary for that sharing, and the vocabulary for describing nasty things that are on my system and taking action. So it's a very big vocabulary. It involves describing the attacker without knowing who the attacker is, techniques and tactics that the attacker has. You know, if you're being scanned from China, there's big companies out there that constantly monitor the net, saying and then coming up with reports, free or otherwise, to say there's bad stuff coming out of this domain.
Is that vocabulary expressed in XML schemas?
Very good. You're ahead of the game.
Okay.
And that vocabulary is described in XML schema. So I come at this Sticks product, if you like, as an end user. I want to be in the Sticks game because the project I'm on, we want to deal in Sticks. So we're tasked with making sense of the Sticks vocabulary, which is in XML schema.
Another question, Stuart. So
yes.
Is that information for humans to be consumed at the end, or is it for automated programs?
Probably both. At the moment, it's so new, it's a couple of years old, and really people are only starting to write Sticks, author, write documents to share, that are basically just, I saw a bad IP address, it might be part of a campaign called X. So it's very, not toy, but it's very limited at the moment. It's ironic because the vocabulary is huge, but yet the actual instance documents that you see are full of IP addresses and domain names and file hashes. So, but it's a good question. At the end of the day, it's got to be a human making a decision on what to do, so the human's got to be able to read it. But as much as possible, I think they're trying to aim at machine-to-machine comms as well. So I don't know the right answer to that question. for observation.
Is this related to physics?
Physics, the discipline?
Yeah. Are
No.
you in the physics department? I thought I saw that on the.
Applied physics. No, I'm a software engineer.
Oh. Okay.
This is not related to physics. This is related to Java and XML.
He just masquerades as a
Software
physicist.
You just work for the physics department as a software.
I work for, I didn't say that, I'm sorry. I work for the Applied Physics Lab as a software engineer, you're right. Okay, I'm going to plow on. So, did Brazil win?
No. Well, we didn't lose. So we didn't lose. So.
So the man in the Brazil shirt pointed out, is this all described in XML schema? Yes, it is. So, I'm a Java fan, so I want to compile these sticks documents into Java so I can work in sticks in Java. I want to author or send stuff out, and I also want to receive sticks documents from other people, and that's the whole point of it being information sharing. And the last 2 points are kind of relevant to me because I'm not the sticks schema author. The people at MITRE in Washington DC have come up with this set of sticks specifications that they've written in XML schema, so I'm not privy to how it's all designed and any errors that there may be in the construction of the schemas. And, as I say, I use Xsd about every 5 years and then completely forget everything that I learned from the last time. So I always come at this bloody thing new. Okay? And it's always flailing around trying to get the stuff to build. So this time I thought, must be a better way than this. Okay. So if you downloaded from MITRE the sticks zip bundle at version 1.1.1 currently, that top URL, if you unbundle that, you get 25 XSD files. That's not a trivial amount of text. Okay. Plenty of room for either ambiguities or plain errors. Okay, plenty of them. So if you do a little find, if you grep and find and do a Unix pipe, just look for the word complex type and the word element, just to get a feel of how big is this thing going to be.
How complex it is.
I'm sorry?
How complex it is.
How complex is this set of 25 files? How much stuff am I trying to ingest? How much stuff am I trying to turn into Java classes? I'd say about, well, I just grepped for complex and found 187 instances of the word. An open element in XML schema to describe a complex type which would be mapped to a Java class. And the same for an element called element in XML schema, 400 instances of that. So without doing any XJC and any Xsd tools at all, just to get a feel of how complicated this stuff is, 600 types. So it's fairly frightening, shall we say. Right? So you can imagine if you've got 600 different types of XML tag or element you could describe, you could have a big set of documents that would say, oh, valid sticks document, 600 types to choose from. Okay, there's a one outer envelope type, but there's plenty of variation within that. So the take home from this slide is all pretty horrendous, and you can get very ugly very quickly. Questions? Already done pretty quickly. Okay. So luckily, MITRE, as well as the sticks schema files, an XSD file. An XSD file is like the file suffix that we give to XML schema documents. If you see .xsd, I'm just talking about those 25 files. They also distribute some sample sticks documents. So MITRE have taken other organisations' reports. So I know here is a company called Mandiant that are in the security world, and they come up with reports. They came up with a big report last year called the APT1 report, saying there is a bad set of IP addresses in China and we think they're attacking the energy sector in the US, and this is the evidence. So that didn't come out as a sticks document, but MITRE translated, if you like, Mandiant's format, which is called, I think, OpenIOC, indicators of compromise, into sticks. And MITRE have done another couple of translations. So it gives the sticks newbie, like me, something to say, if I can get this stuff to build, there are sample documents that I may be able to ingest. And if I can wrestle with this XJC tool to build those Java classes, I can write a little bit of unmarshalling code, which is kind of simple JAXB. And hey presto, although that's a 3 megabyte file, not the sort of thing you want to read, I could ingest it and then I can walk it as it becomes an object graph and I can walk it. Question?
No, I was just gonna some similar experience. I had to deal with some XML schema from the government. It's called JGXCM. It's Global Justice Department thing.
Yeah.
So it was so gigantic that when you know build Java classes with it to the JAXB compiler, it would generate a class that was over 64K, a single class. So it would blow up the limit of the Java compiler for a given file in terms of how many lines you can have.
Source code line limit?
Yeah.
Really?
The limit is 64K.
No, there is a bytecode limit per method of 64K.
All right.
Something like that. Anyways, it's been a long time, but it blew up, so it couldn't compile.
Welcome to my world.
And so I'm wondering if you're having the same problems because we have to
not the same problems, but we've both been fighting with the XJC tool.
Okay.
Safe to say. George.
I was curious, once you get this transformed into Java objects, what was your plan to do with those Java objects?
To be honest, I haven't got that far yet. If I can get over the hurdle of these 2 samples that I've mentioned and the other 10 or 15 that come with it, they're the samples. If I can get those into Java, I could say if they're fairly, I mean they're big, but that doesn't mean they're particularly varied, because although the vocabulary is huge, people are using just IP addresses and domain names. If I can get those samples in, I would feel confident going out into the world saying, I can play sticks, because I know I can understand big sticks files, so I'm sure I can understand yours because it's likely smaller than Mandiant's. But you're right. I haven't got as far as what am I going to do with it now. Okay. To be perfectly honest, it became an obsession just beating the hell out of XJC for the sake of it. Okay, so what we're mostly dealing with is observables. Like I say, the sticks vocabulary is huge, but things you can observe either on the network or on a host. You know, I have a piece of malware, I can see it because the file hash is such and someone told me that's bad. And then the indicator would be the fact that I've got a piece of malware called X on my machine indicates that I've been attacked by whatever, poison ivy. Question?
You mentioned the file hash, and I was wondering, so that's one of the things you compare against on your system to say is good or bad?
Yeah, and sticks as a vocabulary to say, you know, it's not only a file hash, it's an MD5 sum file hash, or it's a SHA-1.
Okay.
So it's very precise, and vocabulary has to be precise if I'm trying to communicate something very precise to you. I can say in sticks, file hash on my system, MD5 is this. It would be a good idea for you to look for it on your system.
Okay.
And there's also a course of action that I haven't really gone into. In my document, I could say, course of action is this, you know, buy this from Sophos and it will clean up your system. So the vocabulary is quite broad. George?
I think you may have asked the question, does the hash code, I mean the hash value, tell you that your XML documents are correct? Is that what you asked?
No, I would.
Okay.
It's along with the IPs and everything you mentioned, those are the things you would be looking for.
Yeah, you're talking about content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I can communicate to you an MD5 sum this. If you see that, you should be worried.
Okay.
Does it also indicate over what byte range the MD5 should match?
I'd have to look at the schemas to see how precise they can be. To be honest, it's, well, I don't know. But it's so huge that I could probably, if there's 600 different types with all their attributes, I could probably find out.
Right, but I'm just saying that if you have the same, if you have an EXE infestor,
yeah,
you're not going to have every single EXE type that could have that infestation have it thing as opposed to having the hash value for the string within the exe.
I'm not with you.
Okay, never mind.
I bet there's a vocabulary in this to say, you know, the right hash code for Internet Explorer.exe is this, if it's version 10. So if you haven't got that, you should be worried.
Oh, okay.
So, like I say, the 600 types is very broad. I think it's actually probably too big, but it's not mine. I'm just a user. Okay. So that's my goal, to get this stuff into my Java program. So how am I going to do it? Well, there are options. And George said something good to me before. Do you have control over the input format? I do not. These documents are given on MITRE's site, and if you want to play sticks, that's your input. Okay, so I can't control the input in any way. So if I want to do this from Java, I could do sacs, pull, parsers, and DOM and all this stuff, but that would just be so time-consuming that the obvious, or so I thought obvious, technology is a Java technology called JAXB. And with that, you just run this tool, which is in the JDK, which is called XJC, and you just run it, and you give it XSD files, these schema document files on input, and it produces the Java classes for you. And it provides supplementary classes to do read and write of documents.
Question. Is there another tool chain that everybody else is using, or is there another everybody else?
In Java?
Well,
Oh, sticks?
yeah.
I have a slide on that. Everyone else is Python. It's just me. Maybe one guy at MITRE is a little bit helpful, but it's like, you know, and I don't particularly like Python as a large code-based kind of top language.
Good choice.
So I like static type checking. I like, you know, Maven builds and artifacts and modules and all this sort of stuff. So in the Java world, if there's something better and newer than JAXB, then I don't know about it, and I probably should. So if anyone does know something that's better than JAXB and doesn't have all those headaches, come and see me.
Well, question. So,
Yes.
what do you think of Jibix then, just out of curiosity?
I've never used it in anger. I remember years ago Dennis giving presentations, and I probably knew so little about JAXB at the time that I didn't know if it was. Is it still current? Is it active?
You can ask Dennis. He'll be here like 2 months from now or something like that.
Yeah, there was a guy at CJUG that wrote his own kind of JAXB, almost competitive technology.
It is. I mean, it's
Yeah.
object mapping, XML to object mapping, essentially. So same sort of thing, but it was driven around performance and doing runtime bytecode modification
Okay.
rather than running it through a compiler to generate everything. So instead of generating code, it would actually do it all at runtime.
Okay. What I didn't mention here, JAXB is XML schema source to Java source. You then compile your sources. We're not talking straight to Java class files. It's just spitting out heavily annotated, using Java annotations. It's heavily annotated Java source code, which I can, you know, you can open and look at, but you don't really care. You just kind of throw it straight at your Java compiler, and then you're done. And it has comments about when it was built by XJC and all this kind of stuff. So really, my battle is with this tool here, just a simple command line tool for which there are Ant and Maven wrappers, and I can, you know, run this from a Maven build. But at the end of the day, all those wrappers are just banging on the central XJC, and it is Java code, so they're loading the XJC class by name and invoking it that way. George.
Did you have to write any of your own marshalling and unmarshalling to support the XJC for some of these complex things?
No, unmarshalling, marshalling. Once you can get XJC to say yes, 600 types in XML schema, 600 or whatever plus Java source files, classes, after that it was all magically working.
Because the one time I worked in this space, I ended up having to edit the schema to simplify it so that I could get it to run through. And even then I had to supply it with marshallers.
Maybe tools have improved since then.
It could be.
Yeah.
That's a good point. You bring up a good point. There are basically two technologies you can do. If you've got XML schema documents that you don't control, like I don't, I mean, I can download them and edit them, but the next time they update the version, I'm playing catch up forever.
Yep.
So I can edit them in place to fix it. I can develop what's called JAXB bindings files, where you do the same fixes but not in the XML schema documents. That's better because then when they update, at least I haven't lost my edits. But oh, sorry, I've forgotten the question now.
No, but the binding files is the path I was talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I have had to write binding files, but that's kind of almost orthogonal to the tool I'm going to kind of present in. But I do still need binding files. I'm not saying that my tool that walks all these files first, gives the result to XJC, solves all the problems. I still have an external bindings file that says those schema documents, that will translate to Java class A from a document over there, and a document in some other part of the schema will also translate to a Java class A. That will be a name clash and the tool won't do it, and it stops and produces nothing. Then you can subvert the name generation algorithm of XJC to say, call that A prime, so it doesn't clash with A. So I had to do a little bit of that, but not much. And to be fair, those bindings were contributions by someone to the MITRE effort. So there is maybe one or two other Java people in this arena, but not many. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So when you've got all this working, this is an instance of unmarshalling. So you've got an XML, you've got Mandiant's APT1 report, 3 megabytes. It's a sticks instance. When I mean instance, it's not the schema files that I just mentioned that you download and build from. This is now an instance document. This is Mandiant saying bad IP address, all wrapped up in huge XML markup. So the way you do that, if I've got this sticks document as a file input stream, and this is kind of JAXB classes, JAXB context is the entry point into JAXB programming, you have to dream up all the packages that of objects that you're possibly going to use. So this is a headache too. On a large schema that generates lots of class files in lots of different packages, I've still got a somewhat manual method for generating this string with these path separators to say these are all the packages that I may need to ingest these documents coming in. Okay, so when I've got the JAXB context JC, you then just ask it for an unmarshaller, then you give it a file input stream describing the file you've got. Has anyone ever written code like that? Unmarshal an XML document? Yeah? Okay, a couple, good, thank you. The line in red is really handy. I found this on Stack Overflow. If you don't know what's happening and the unmarshal gives you horrendous errors, put one of these event handlers in, because it tells you a lot more about the error than the unmarshaller will by itself. So if you do this, then that's a good take-out. It will tell you your schema defines some interface, or what becomes an abstract Java class, and you can't instantiate that, but it will give you the error that it's trying to. Whereas without that, you just get no kind of useful error at all. Okay. So that's when the document is on disk, and I want to turn that file, no matter how complicated that is, I want to turn that into a Java object that I can then use getters and setters on to manipulate, and maybe manipulate it and then write it back out. So marshalling is essentially the reverse. You use what's called object factories, and then you build up the object graphs, and then you say marshal, and you can put it out over the network or to a file. So that's just a kind of JAXB 101, if you like. Question?
I'm not sure I understand the new instance. You said those were the package names? Is that what you said?
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to know, when you run the XJC tool on the schemas you've got, you have to essentially know all the different Java packages that it may have put classes into, or at least all the reachable ones.
So how does it know? It has an XML file. How does it dream up package names?
From the target name. So, the step to do that is before this part.
Yeah.
The XJC tool looks at XML schema attributes called the target namespace, which you can think of as mapping directly to a Java package.
Yeah.
So if a target namespace is, I'll show some, I don't know, http example.com, say, then if you don't say anything to XJC to say what you want the package to be, you can imagine that it will give you a Java package called com.example, and it'll put all the classes that are defined under that target namespace in that package.
Okay. And the colon there, they're just taking Linux as an inspiration for specifying the path?
Yeah, yeah. So, but this is actually a problem because this doesn't seem to come for free or output of XJC in any way. You know, this is a huge schema set. I've got a horrendous stream here. But I probably could go back and think of a way of automating it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it seems a little strange, but thank you.
Yeah, the whole thing's strange. George?
So I was just, most people don't necessarily know, but the namespace spec in XML is very bad, and you can put almost anything you want, and it's technical, you know, for the prefixes. And as long as the path that the prefix points to is the same, it's all supposed to be the same document.
Okay.
And so I think that's what they're trying to say here is, you know, if you see this thing, that's, you know, they're using the path kind of concept, it seems to me, to deal with the namespace problem. It's a better solution not to use namespaces, but of course, again, you don't have any control over the sticks document.
You can't not use namespaces.
Of course you can.
Do you write all your Java classes in no package?
No. In XML, you can do it without namespaces.
You can do it in Java too. You wouldn't want to. How long is it going to take your foo.java to clash with mine?
If I'm writing a marshalling for a particular source of XML, that source of XML does not need to have namespaces. My code needs to have namespaces.
If you're in control of the source, yeah, you're right. If you're in control of the source and the schema, you can simplify this. Right. I am not in control of either the schema or the source documents. Okay. Question.
But what happens if you omit one of those package names, like acme.com?
The unmarshaller blows up with essentially no class definition found error.
So it knows it's looking for acme.com, or it
sees
for foo.org.x and then acme.com.x and then just goes through each one.
It would. That's a good question. If I omit that and then some instance document comes in with an element defined in that target namespace, it would. There's enough metadata in the Java source files to know that mapping. It will try and find that class using probably reflection and fail, and the unmarshal will fail, and it will fail with no object at all. No matter how deep that error was, you can imagine 50 elements into a complex XML document. Suddenly you've got a type used in the XML that your XJC tool compiled fine, but you didn't jar all those up and take to your unmarshaller. So what builds in Java, first of all it compiles, then it builds, but it still won't run. And that's unusual.
So at this level you don't have to worry about name collisions. You mentioned previously that you have to do some tweaking to avoid name collisions from that.
That's a good question. All the name collision avoidance is done at the compilation from XSD file, XML schema documents, to Java source. Once you've got the Java source files in hand, I believe you can compile those, and if you get this package list right, you will always be able to ingest. But they're two big ifs.
You may be able to get to the source files, but they may not compile. Because depending on your XML schema, like I said, like if you do JGXDM and you run to a JAXB,
yeah,
their definitions are so humongous, recursive and crazy,
yeah,
that you get this large, humongous
so you're saying, let me get this straight, the XJC tool passes, the Java class source files are generated and then won't compile.
It won't compile because technically it's a valid source file.
Yeah.
I mean, all the code is correct, It's just that the Java cannot handle a 64 KB size file.
I don't
as
have
a
that.
class.
I am not addressing that problem here. I'm just fighting with the JAXB tool itself.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. So, the brains behind all this, a very quick introduction to JAXB. The sticks schemas look something like this. Namespace, prefix, to say we're talking XML schema, that's this line. So the outer tag, the outer element in an XML schema land is always the word schema. The target namespace attribute says, for Java bindings, it says, when you compile this complex type that's called A in XML, I want you to put it in a package A in Java. So the class, as you think of a Java class, would be lowercase a dot big A dot Java. Okay? So that's the hint to XJC. That's the XML schema version of namespaces. It's called the target namespace, which says anything in this document, and this is tiny, any complex type is associated with A. So this could be Stuart's A and George's A, and they wouldn't clash. Okay?
So the class and path name that it generates is going to be A.A?
Thank you. Yeah. So if you got that, that's a tiny valid XML schema file called it A.xsd. If I then give that to the XJC tool on the command line, what I get output is in directory A.java, just like you said, and also an object factory generated by the tool, so that if I want to build objects in memory that conform to this schema, and I can do it via that object factory is my entry point into building those object graphs. Does that make sense? So that's the tool itself in use on a tiny file. Now imagine you've got 25 of these, the sticks thing I've got, and they're huge, and they have interdependencies as I've shown. That XML schema document there is standalone. It doesn't depend on anything else. It can produce A.A, but this type, in this case this type's empty, but it's valid. But it doesn't depend on anything else. So, of course, describing real vocabularies, you're going to get dependencies. Type A, type B may be composed of things from other schemas. So XML schema's got this notion of import. So you're saying, I'm importing the whole of the namespace A, and I want the tool to find it in that location. So if you give the XJC tool that file called that B, you'll get, and the target namespace is B, and the complex type, i.e. the Java class I'm going to try and build is uppercase B. It will build you b.java, B's object factory, but it'll also produce A, because it's noticed that B essentially depends on A, and you're giving it a schema location. So the tool actually, imagine like a kind of hash include in C, or maybe an import in Java. It suspends where it is in parsing this file, goes off to find A.xsd, generates all the Java objects it needs to from that, and then goes back to B. Does that make sense? Now imagine that on a large scale with sticks classes, sticks instance documents with many imports. So you get this horrible tree, actually graph, directed, it's like the graph of these import relationships between things. And I've kind of dreamed up this notion of the universe is what I call the universe, all the schema documents I either hand to XSD at the command line, plus all the ones that it can locate via import. If that makes any sense. Okay. So, the two errors, and mainly is the first error that is the root of the problem of all this work. If I've got that simple XML schema document A, and I say XJC on A, it just had a target namespace of A and a complex type of uppercase A, it will build, and it will produce me those two Java classes. I can say A.xsd twice, and the tool is still happy with that. It's like it knows that the schema locations are the same file, so it doesn't say you've got a name clash, because you've said the same file name twice. So these tiny files came about from me just wrestling with this thing saying, I don't understand this and my schemas are huge. I have to find out the root cause of why this stuff isn't working. So I just dreamed up these A and B.xsds. So this works, but if I copy A to a new file and then give those two files on input, then it blows up saying A is already defined. They're in the same target namespace because they're essentially the same content as I did a copy. So I'm now in the land of XJC barfing at me saying, I can't do this, and you get nothing. Okay? Now that's obviously easy. Well, Stuart, you're stupid, why did you do that? But if it's 25 schema documents with 600 types, loads of imports, and you didn't write them, it's not so easy to spot that that's an obvious error, and what do all these errors mean that come out of this, and how do I fix it? Okay. The second error, and it kind of not as important as the first, but if you have to fix name collisions because there is no other way around it, then you do it in what's called a bindings file, which I've called X. XJB is the standard JAXB suffix for a bindings file. And you would say here, in this file, I know there's a type that's called foo, but it will cause a problem. So when you turn it into Java, call it foobar instead. You can say that. But if I provide to XJC this binding file with this -b option you do, but I'm only actually compiling A, then it complains again. It's saying, well, you've given me an input of A.xsd, but you've also given me a bindings file, but XSD is not even part of the compilation, i.e. doesn't appear as an input on the command line, I've only got A. So that blows up as well. So you've got these two kind of different style of problems, both of which really hard to understand the error when it's not your input. Okay. So that's JAXB, and the problems I have with JAXB kind of abstracted into tiny documents. The stick zip file that I alluded to earlier, if I just unpack that, I get something describes a cyber campaign, some core sticks types, some common sticks types, some indicators, some threat actors, blah, blah, blah. And then they've got extensions saying how to describe the identity of a partner, how to describe a Microsoft vulnerability, or does anyone know the CVEs? US Cert puts out these CVEs saying bad bug in Word or Adobe Flash or Acrobat Reader or whatever. They give names and numbers to common vulnerabilities in the computer world. So people have tried to describe those vulnerabilities in whatever this CVRF language is, and the sticks people have said, well, rather than us try to describe vulnerabilities, we'll reach out to XML schemas that are already there and just expand our vocabulary by using what's already there. So the sticks zip bundle that expands to these 25 files, and I've mentioned like 7, has got these extensions in them. They basically point us to other people's vocabulary definitions. So this is what you want to happen. You unpack the zip you get from MITRE, you run XJC on all the files and the extensions directory, because XJC as a tool is nicer than it takes any number of files and any number of directories, and for all directories it will recurse finding all the XSD files. So that's the goal, that line there. If that worked, I wouldn't be standing here. Okay? So there's loads of errors. And, you know, it's other people's work. I can't or don't want to get into the world of editing these. So the problem and the solution you need to get to is to make essentially that line or a variation of it work for you, so you've got Java classes coming out. Okay, so what I want to do now is jump to a little demo of something. Hold on a sec. What I want to do is, if I just gave Imagine the 25, say some subset of those 25 documents. Imagine those as a set of XSD files for which I've got a mapping that's on standard out of the actual name to the label on the node, because the names are so long that if I tried to draw the whole name on this graphic, it would be just a mess of text. So I've done a little mapping here saying F1 is the campaign file, and F2 is the course of action file. So I picked the XSD files that are in the top level directory, not the extensions. I've just said all the top level XSD files, and I've just drawn them graphically with a mapping. So, if I mouse over, it will say that's the file, and I haven't ingested this data yet, so I don't know the target namespace. The target namespace for each of these documents is in the data, is in the file, but I have to open it to see that. So this is just kind of a forerunner of, imagine you've got 11 files, but you haven't parsed them yet. Okay? So they're standalone and you've got no relationships between them because you haven't looked at their content. So the problem that I'm having with the stick stuff is, as you can imagine, if 600 types, they're going to use imports to describe relationships between one part of the vocabulary and another part of the vocabulary. Now, unfortunately, although they bundle all the schema document files up, if I take two of those 25, two of the ones in the top level directory, one's called sticks core, so it's a bunch of types, and one's called sticks common, which you can imagine from its name is more common things used throughout the vocabulary. If I cat the core file, and here's a snippet, they say we're importing the common side, the sticks common namespace, and here's where it is. And you'll notice that's an HTTP URL. So although they bundled things, they've kind of also referred to things remotely. If that makes any sense. If I cat the sticks common itself, we see that it's got a target namespace that matches the one in the import of the core file. So they've given me both files in the bundle, but really I only want the core, because if I include the common to the XJC tool, I'm going to get this name clash. Is that making any sense? Yeah? You've got two files and a given relationship between kind of two documents such that you don't want one of your files. Because this is as though, if I give these two to XJC, it's as though I was giving a.xsd and a2.xsd. It's going to say, hold on, you've got a name clash because such and such is already defined. You're going to get the same problem here. Okay? If I give it that file, it's going to resolve that import and go and translate all of the common stuff, and then it's going to get to that file on its command line, and it's going to say, hold on, I've already seen this namespace, and I found it at that HTTP URL. So there's the problem. And again, given that I now know enough about these documents, that's a simple example, but there's 25 of these, and loads of name clashes, and I can't spend forever identifying each one individually, and it wouldn't really do me much good even if I could, not in a systematic way. So here's an example. If I give all of the XSD files to XJC at once, all the sticks schema, it says, well, you gave me this data marking file as a file, the URL as a file URL, but I'd already seen that when I was parsing some other file that imported the same thing at Mitre site as an HTTP URL. So that's another concrete example of a name clash, and you get nothing out of the tool. You don't get any Java classes at all, because it just stops one error, the whole thing's off, the game's off.
So the line numbers are different. Are those two files actually identical, or are they different? I mean, similar but different.
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I just took this from an example of the output. That is a good point. Why would that be different?
One's the start of the definition, one's the end of the definition.
You just got to include from different files that points to the same thing. So
No,
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure if that's right or not.
You're right. I think one is pulling from the URL on the web.
and the other one is local.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
that's
but
the question is,
assuming that the thing that is on the web was packaged and bundled to me to unpack, I see your point. I don't know is the answer.
okay.
So it should be. I think the content should be the same. It could be line number and formatting of the data. So I've got those issues. I can't get the bloody stuff to build, and I want to do it in Java. And here's my experiences with MITA. Oh wow, Python works. Why don't you do it there? So there's very few people trying this at the moment in Java. I prefer the blank response actually to that word works for me. Okay, so there is a couple of people, but not a lot. So I think this was a worthy kind of tool for me to
So
do.
Stu,
Yes.
so my favorite, one of my favorite dynamic programming languages is actually Jython.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard about it or not.
Jython.
Yeah, it's basically Python syntax which generates JVM bytecodes.
Okay.
So I was wondering if that's something you might consider looking into. I mean, because then you can take their Python programs and run it. Although you still need the mapping though, I guess, so maybe it won't serve your use
Does it
case
have-
there.
Does it have duck typing?
Ruby does.
No,
Is it-
Python doesn't have. It's just it's loosely typed, so yeah, it doesn't have duck typing. I mean,
But
it's,
that's not that type.
Yeah. If
I guess
Jython
by
has the
definition,
same type
yeah.
system as Python, then I'm not interested. It's the Wild West.
static guy.
It's not software engineering. It's hacking. George.
So,
Alright.
at some point, did you decide that you needed to normalize your XSD and compare them?
I think you're leading me to where I'm going to go.
Okay.
So that's where I was at. It won't build. I've got no help. I flailed around, hacking at these XSD files, seeing what the output of the XJC tool was, really with no method at all. And you go on Stack Overflow and Google and you say, I've got this problem, and Sun, now they're Oracle, so they're kind of not interested in JAX-B problems anymore. There's not a lot of current answers out there. So you fix a bit, and then you say, I've done it, and then you give it the new set to XJC, and you get some other error that you've never seen before. So it's just horrible. And I thought, I've got to work out what the problem is. I need a method for this, and that's what I've come up with. Oh yeah, so one point, if you minimize your input set, you say one XSD file, hey, it builds, great. Okay, I've only got 15 of the Java classes of the 600 I need, but as long as the documents out there in the sticks land, as long as they're small and they only include what maps to 15 Java classes, I'm done. So you're not talking the sticks speak, but you're talking a little bit, but that's no good either, because it's not going to take long. Like if you only give XJC tool a couple of those sticks documents, you are not going to be able to read in the Mandiant APT1 report, because it's 3 meg and highly varied. So that doesn't work either, you're just kind of cheating yourself. You need, question.
So were there individual ones that wouldn't compile on their own? I mean, could you compile all of them separately with XJC and then basically compile them all with Java C together?
Could you compile them all individually? Yes, but you'd have to do a lot of work to figure out what that sequence was. And again, I think you'd almost be in more out of hope than method. You know? Don't quite have an answer to that. I'll press on. So what I've done is, I've written a tool that basically walks the set of XSD files following all the imports. So in just the same way that you give XJC a set of input documents, either in files or directories, I built a tool called Xsd Walker that essentially does the same thing. So you give it a set of files, URLs and directories on input, it enumerates all the input to produce a set of XSD URLs, and then it just, for each one in that input set, it just walks, opens each one, finds the target namespace, finds all the imports, and recursively walks those. So it builds up a graph of the relationships, so I can then, and if I have a graphic, I can see that graph, and now I can understand why XJC is complaining. Okay. And the method to make XJC work is just walk the graph, identify in the graph only the leaf nodes, because you know that XJC will resolve all the inputs as it walks the graph. So if I've got a set of nodes L that are leaf nodes, then my problem in sticks is that some remote nodes clash with some local nodes. So when I've got my leaf set L, it's probably very hard to understand, I just need to say for all the nodes, for all the XSD documents in my leaf node, are there any elements in that set that are also in the universe of documents as a remote node? So basically it's just set differences. I take all the ones I could reach remotely out of L, and what I've got left is the set of XML schema documents that will work when you give them to XJC, because I've sidestepped the name clash problem. And then I thought, well, how am I going to do a good way of outputting that is to just put all those nodes in just one XSD file and just say import them all, and then I just give one file to the tool.
So you're saying anytime you have a local file and a remote file that have the same base name, you just ignore the local file?
Yes, because when the XJC tool hits an import of the remote one, and then it sees your local one, you're in the name clash problem. Okay, and I don't want to edit all the documents I've got to overwrite the HTTP URLs with local ones, because one of my goals was to not edit the input. Okay, so what I'll do here is jump to my graphic, and I'll kill that one, because that's just the set of things you could give it. And I'll say, no, I don't want to do that. What I want to do is, so here's the graph. This is why you don't want to do this thing manually. What I've done there is, I've got 50, I've walked the graph. I've taken all the input documents that came in my package, 25 XSD files, and I've walked that graph, opened all those documents and resolved all their imports, and graphed that. And the green ones are my local files, things that would be inputs, things that were given to me by Jython. So I've got F6. What's F6? I didn't want to put the text all over the place. F6 was TLP marking.xsd. It's one of the extensions you may have seen. You try and get that back. So it's a local file. It has this target namespace, and it imports wherever that node points to, wherever this edge points to, represents an import relationship. So given all the green inputs to the tool, it resolves all the imports, and it always imports to a remote node, which is what I call the H. And then I've identified in red all the local files that cause the name clash just by doing the set differencing. So basically, I've got to identify the green but not the red, which is just simple, I can say set differencing, and then I'm done. If that makes any sense. Okay, so this is quite a nasty graph, and not the sort of thing you want to do by hand, because I've got 75 nodes and I've got 152 edges, so you could almost, it'd be more work to, I think, manually sequence individual runs of the tool than to write a tool to go over it, I think. And this tool is not stick specific at all, it's totally general.
Did you say when you picked those original 11 clean?
Yep.
What was the criteria, or did you say, or did I miss it?
I just picked the core set of there's like 11 XSD files from sticks that seem to be the core ones, and then there's the extensions ones that are really someone else's work.
All right.
So I just picked the 11 from the core to build that graph. Okay.
So could you have just done it in a much more stupid way by completely ignoring the graph structure and just looking at the import statement base names,
Yep.
comparing them to your local file base names, and
Yep.
saying, It's got the same base name, just no import local file.
Yeah, you could have done that. That would have been a lot of work and probably error prone.
See why you
There's
would
a lot-
need more work.
There's lots of imports. There's 25 files,
Right.
and so there's imports, and then there's imports of those imports, because this is a graph that goes all the way back to very primitive XSD files, that doubling core stuff that lots of documents use.
So some of those red files match against the name that's not imported by any of the local files, but that's imported by something that the local file imports that's out on the web.
Yes, exactly. George.
So, I didn't get a feel for how were you determining that something was a duplication?
If it's a file URL, right? If it's a file URL, that one is a file. That would be an input to XJC. If
Right.
that came from MITA. If that has a namespace the same as a node in that graph, that is remote by definition of having an HTTP URL.
So you weren't actually doing a structural comparison of the XSD?
I'm doing no, it's a namespace comparison.
Thank you.
These two documents, one local, one remote, have the same target namespace and will produce a problem. Were I to give them to the XJC tool.
I thought you could have the same namespace but have different element names in it, and that's not a problem.
That's true, but they are essentially the same document and they define the same complex types. You're right, you can have different documents with different parts of a namespace.
Right. But
The
you didn't
assumption
have that.
is, if it's the same namespace, I think he's just assuming that it's the same, effectively the same content.
Yes, I am making that assumption. And that assumption in this case is correct. Okay, where am I? So what I'm doing as an example, here's an example XSD file. What my code is doing is opening this up and using XPath to locate that attribute of the outermost element, this element here, schema. That's the attribute I'm after, so I need that string. And then I'm walking down this file further, and I'm doing this for all files that I find recursively. I'm looking for these statements. So one element in from the schema outermost element of these imports. So I'm just parsing these elements, taking out the namespace attribute and the schema location attribute. So it's just a classic kind of graph walk algorithm.
So is it basically a dependency graph that you were showing up there?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And the arrow points to the dependency?
And the arrow points to the dependency. Yeah, sure, I did say that. Yeah. So, where am I going with this? So, this is the tool in action. It's a Java tool wrapped up with a shell script. You give it an Uber name, Sticks call, and then you say all the XSD files. So in this case, the 11 files that Stick says are the core XSD files. So the tool produces this file, the name I give it on input, plus this uber.xsd, and all that is a fabricated schema document that imports all of the leaf nodes that I'm finally going to want XJC to look at. So I've done the work that says these will not fail with any name clashes by manipulating that graph. And now I just give one file to XJC, maybe with some external bindings, and I get a successful XML schema to Java compilation, which was my goal. Okay, there are some things that are still broken in XJC land based on the input document, so I've had to embellish this a little bit. There's a -e option to say, in this extensions directory, there are XML schema documents that just will not build, and I don't want to take the time to go and edit them. And I've got two of those. This oval file, some vulnerability vocabulary, just will not build. And I've also got this -g option, just gives you the ability to plot all that.
So that is not going to cause your resulting set of Java files to be incomplete?
It is, good point, it is. It is. If I came across a Sticks document that I wanted to ingest and it had that vocabulary in it, it would not work. You're right. I would argue that, well, I can state that I'm about, well, I haven't done the actual number, I'm probably about 95, 99% of the way into a full compilation. These are minor, but you're right, it's not a 100% coverage. question.
Are you open sourcing your tool?
It's on GitHub actually. Yeah. My first ever GitHub.
Awesome.
So I got 1 star too. For that thing I made. George.
The two that didn't work. Do
Well,
they
it's
have?
not two. It's not 2 files. This has got many in it.
Okay,
This
that
is
was
2 entry points that don't work.
So those are not leaves.
That is a leaf. That may have leaves under it because this is a directory. So you can say on my exclude syntax, exclude anything under there that you find and exclude that actual file. So just like you can, I didn't say, but just like you can give my tool the same input flavors as you can give the XJC tool, file names, directory names, and in mine you can actually give it HTTP URLs, which is handy as well.
So you're telling it to exclude files in this local directory, but if one of your initial XSD files includes something, an HTTP reference to the equivalent file,
Yeah.
it will still go out there and use
Correct,
that one.
correct. All I'm doing is pruning the input to the XJC tool. You're right, exactly right. For anyone who's interested in command line parsing, Apache Commons CLI is a great Java package for doing command line processing in Java. And this is all wrapped up in a Maven POM.
So did you happen to try and verify whether the files you're excluding are included in your resulting tree from the web?
You mean,
So in other words, is there an oval.xsd that's in your graph from an HTTP reference?
no, that is a leaf. That file there is a leaf that won't build because its imports contain a clash.
Right. The question was, do any of those other XSD files or any of their transitive references include a reference to oval.xsd from an HTTP reference?
No. And then if anyone wants to see the code, anyone know that quote? Anyone know that? Who said that? Linus Torvalds?
Cool.
Okay, talking cheat sheet on the case. If anyone wants to see the code, it's on GitHub. I'm quite happy to show it here as
Who
well.
said that?
Linus Torvalds.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So how is it organised? You can imagine it's just Java file. It takes command line input and parses it and finds all the XSD files that you want to include and exclude. And then for all the ones that you want to include, they're the leaf nodes. It just walks each of those recursively, building up a set of things it's already visited. And when you visit a node, you point an edge from the referring node to the current node, and then when you've opened that node using XPath, you resolve the imports and you point from where you are now to the things you've imported. So it's just a classic graph walk. I used XPath in Java for the XML schema document parsing, and I realised that you have to know about namespaces in XPath for this to work. If anyone wants to see the code, I can share that. And then it outputs one file that you then give to XJC. And that's all I have. And there's my summary. George?
What was the graph form output?
The graph output just gave me a text file so that I could do things like this.
But what form did the text file?
I just straight text, either an N for a node with its location and its namespace, or an E for an edge.
Okay.
The whole reason that I didn't put the graphical side in with the tool is that the package I use for graphing has got a nasty license on it that I can't really distribute that code. So, and I wanted to put this on GitHub. So I have two tools: the Xsd Walker tool that you need to do the work, but then a graphical kind of bolt-on, essentially, so that I could show this graphically.
So you wrote a second app, which was your graph visualizer.
Yes, just for almost the purposes of getting this across, maybe better graphically than solely from text.
But that was my question. You didn't use the dot format.
I did not use the dot format. No, I just used the homegrown one because it was a very quick and dirty one, and I don't know dot that well. I've seen it, but I wouldn't know. If anyone's interested, this graphing package is called Y-Files. for Java from a German company called Yworks. Fantastic
Oh yeah.
API, not free. First and only piece of software I've ever bought. On my department at work, bought. I didn't cough up myself. But it's great, and the documentation is fantastic. It's a case of you get what you pay for. It's a fantastic library for Java, if anyone cares about swing-based graphics nowadays. And they have offerings for Ajax and Flex and HTML5 and stuff as well.
Jive?
Sorry?
Is it Jide, the name of the company?
Y5.
Oh, okay.
Yworks.com
Right.
is the name of the company, and Y-Files is the product. It's closed source. I don't have the source.
I got
By
And,
the
and Y as in the letter Y.
You mentioned swing, I thought about Jive. It was another,
Oh, Jive, J.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
it's another graphing library,
So
commercial.
that's my summary. That's the GitHub URL if anyone wants to download it. I've showed you it applied to sticks because that was my problem, but there's nothing in that code that is sticks specific at all. It's just an XSD document walker essentially.
Cool.
Any more questions? That's all I have.
So is your tool incorporated as part of the build process? So that
That's a good point. It's not a Maven plugin. I've never written a Maven plugin, and I don't know how much work it would be. It would be
but
nice.
you can probably just run it as a command line exec.
I run
or
it
something
command
like
line, and then I do Maven.
Okay.
So it's not particularly integrated, but it's good enough for mine.
Actually, you can just run the command line tool from Maven as an exec. So you don't need like a plugin.
You need an
I'm
exec.
sure
Can you
that-
run an exec for Maven?
You should be able to. I would
Run an
think.
ant, I know that.
No, you should be able. There should be an exec plugin or something for Maven.
You
Really?
can do it through a plugin, but not directly.
No,
I
not
mean, you
directly.
need a
Yes,
plugin.
yes. Sorry. Yeah, you can't
Always
just
need a
execute
plugin
a command
for
line.
Maven, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that.
I'm doing it the old school way.
That's cool.
Like command line, XSD Walker first, then I've got my Uber file, and then my XJC invocation is Maven powered. It's the JVNet.
But you only do that when it actually changes, right? Whenever you get a new dump.
Exactly,
essentially.
exactly.
Right.
When you get a new dump from them, which is, at the moment quite often because it's in flux, because
Oh,
it's new.
right.
So,
I have one question.
yeah,
Which team are you cheering for the World Cup?
not the same shirt as you're wearing. I'm supporting England and the US.
So you should ask me that question.
Okay, any more
What's the
observations other than questions? Yeah, George.
Have you thought about changing the XSD comparator, making that an option to dynamically load?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, your comment about the namespace, utilizing the namespace for file matching.
Content
Given that,
matching,
given the fact that you can actually have the same namespace without collisions, by having different parts of the namespace per file.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. Have I? Well, no, and I've probably been scared away from the observation that says, well, that line 14 doesn't match that line 26. So I would have thought file content matching might be tricky.
Well, right, but that's why you can't just compare the contents, you actually have to notify, so to speak, the actual XSD XML so that you can then do a smart comparison. Which basically means you have to write your own XSD parser.
Well,
I think that was
that's what I'm trying to avoid. I mean,
I
I've
know.
done just enough of an XSD parser to find the pertinent information for me. Writing a full-blown XSD parser is essentially rewriting XJC, which must be
No.
horrendous.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about writing it so that you can compare elements to determine whether they are the same.
Oh, I see. No, you're right. I've fallen back on the result of XJC itself either telling me they're the same or not telling me the same, which is what I'm hoping for. You're right. It's slightly contrived, maybe. I say this is generally applicable. Maybe it's slightly contrived in the MITRE people have referenced things remotely, yet given me the universe or the leaf nodes, all of them, and they do always match.
My concern is that it sounds like they have been friendly in the idea that each file has its own namespace.
Yes, it does.
But that's not a requirement of XSDs. And that's what I'm saying.
True. That's true. But I'll tell you one thing I have learned. It's not a requirement, but all the files, all the XSD files in the same namespace have to be given to XJC at once. You can't do them individually. I saw that written down by one of the real power authors at Sun, and he never really said why. He just
When
said
you say given it once,
As input.
as input to the XJC tool.
you can't hunt them down and still work, you mean?
No, what I'm saying is if you've got an XSD file with some complex type in namespace A, and I've got another XSD file with some complex types in namespace A, yes, they can exist in two different files, but you have to give both of those files at the same time to the XJC tool. That's just an observation, and I don't know why, but I think that would hamper building up your input set. Question?
So they deliver you a bunch of files.
Yep.
And you're basically discarding some subset of those.
Yep.
But every file, is it true that every file they give you when they do import something, it's always importing it using the URL?
Remote URL, yes.
And the other question is every file that they're giving you, does it also exist as all those root files you're using? Do they exist also?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Because
I could check.
so maybe what you could do is you could just ask them to give you the URL
Yeah.
of the all-inclusive file.
Yeah, you could. You're right. You could. You could say I don't want documents. I can, because XJC can walk remote URLs just as easy as local.
One URL, you say run XJC on that, and it includes everything else.
His graph indicates that that's not the case. There
Well,
were more
because
green. There were more greens than there were reds.
Right, he had a bunch of local root nodes, but what I'm saying is you could ask them to create one root node that refers to all of those green files that presumably there's a copy of them out on the web.
Well, I think you're right, and I think I know what they'd say. They'd say, well, it works in Python, why should I? Because someone's got to be paid to do it.
Well, you got it, right? You just created it. You just need
Yeah.
your local ones,
Yeah.
just modify it
Right.
to
I have
HTTP
essentially
version,
created
and then
it,
send it to them and say, here, this is your root file. Please put that on your website.
Maybe you're right. Yeah, yeah. They did acknowledge the work, so that was good.
Cool.
Question. Observation.
What if you unplug from your computer from the NAT? You can't resolve those HTTP addresses.
True.
What do you get then? As you get
XJC timing out.
Times
Yeah.
out. It always wants to remote access then, I guess.
It has no alternative. You haven't told it anything else. If it sees an import of an HTTP URL, it tries to follow it.
Yeah.
You know, what does your web browser do? It just times out.
So, in that graph, there were quite a few files on the net. Are some of those not included in the distribution they gave you?
Yeah, loads. Because of the imports, there's loads of more blue there than there is green.
So are the imports going out to like different domains?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
The imports are going out to some arbitrary set of locations of which manually I don't want to follow.
So did you look at other, maybe this has been asked already, did you look at other tools besides XJC?
No, if you know of one.
I think XML-Beans, am I remembering that right? Is that a project?
Yeah.
That's the WebLogic. This is the WebLogic stuff, right? Started out as WebLogic and then got donated.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's another binding object, XML
Stuff
object binding technology.
I don't know if it would handle the collisions like you have, but it did generate Java code and tons of it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll mention that I used XML-Beans at Boeing, and I casually mentioned, looking at the code, that, oh, by the way, this doesn't handle namespaces right. And like the manager just went ballistic. It's like, what do you mean it doesn't handle namespaces right? I says, well, it doesn't. And it's like, well, but it's working because you're controlling the XML.
Right.
So I mean, I've worked with XJC a little bit, not as much as I do with XML-Beans, but I don't know how well it looks like it does a better job with namespaces than XML-Beans did. So XML-Beans literally hard-coded the namespace prefix into the results, which is not what the XML spec says. The XML spec says that the prefix can be anything as long as what it refers to is the same.
There's a guy on Stack Overflow recommending Woodstock. I don't know.
My understanding of it still is that JAXB and XJC is kind of still the standard, although it's on the wane.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know XML beans. I've heard of Jython way back in the day, but never used it. So
XML-Beans was pretty weak. You couldn't understand complex schemas.
Yeah, I was
very
being pretty overwhelmed by it.
This is
There was someone else who had done
this
more.
this set of XML schemas, when you resolve all the imports, I mean, I say 25 files bundled to me. When you resolve the imports, you know, you're talking 150 odd documents. It gets complex because the vocabulary it's trying to describe is almost natural language processing wrapped up in XML. It's so wordy what they're trying to say.
It's almost exactly like the global JGXDN thing. They're trying to be, the Justice Department global way of communicating.
Right.
And the thing was humongous, huge.
But people like MITRE, big corporations in DC, get billions of dollars to do this stuff.
Oh, I know. Same thing happened with Omit. Yeah.
So the government wants to see this STIX document format promoted. So if you say you're going to do it, you get grants.
This was the Homeland Security lingua franca. All police departments, all the things would use the JSDX to talk among themselves and to share information.
Does it work?
Yeah. I don't know. So
I mean, is it being used? That's probably.
It's being used. It's being used.
Yeah.
I did a project that's being used at the Washington State of the Courts. They're using it.
Okay. So it's got
But
traction.
some people are using it. I don't know how global the thing is, but it was, it defines person, for example, all the way to siblings and parents and grandparents and
This stuff's got that.
and every single thing has a data type. It's complex types over complex types over. It's just great.
That's probably even worse than
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, thanks, Stuart.
Okay, thanks.
And if folks want to go for a beer, please stick around.